So, we were discussing my teens, and I think part two I titled The Best of Times and the Worst of Times. And now I need to explain to you how it became the worst of times, I'm afraid. So, I was at a stage in my life where everything seemed to be building to a crescendo. I was with these really great people who were full of faith and fire, as it seemed to me, young people. After years of being totally isolated, I felt like I kind of had friends, um, whom I had something in common with and could really reach out and make a connection to. And yet somehow that connection never really formed the way I expected it to. Apologies, just testing. Don't want to be interrupted. I had only one friend close enough to really ever visit their house on a regular basis of any sort, and they were, God bless their soul, they were well-meaning, but our connection to each other was very superficial. And actually, when the rubber hit the road, it turned out that we didn't really understand each other that well at all and didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. Even so, I miss hanging out at his house. I guess beyond the fact that we both were into sci-fi, we didn't really gel that well together. I'll give you an example of how things were shallow, even though I felt they were deep. I thought I had these incredible friends who were super passionate about God and super passionate about the world, about building a better world, and who I could really connect with. And yet, when they ended up cancelling their youth meeting for a week because various reasons it couldn't be held, they rung me to tell me it was cancelled, and I was hugely disappointed because it was a highlight of my week. What I didn't find out until later is that they had all, off the back of themselves, organised a trip out to the cinema, like just last minute, and they didn't think to invite me. And I have to wonder if it was that they didn't think to invite me because they thought it would be a nuisance for me to come because they lived like 40, it would mean going into the next city over and it would have been some transport issues. But it felt much more like, nah, if we're just socializing, we don't really want him. Or at the very least, I was an afterthought. That hurt a lot. And looking back, I was always on the periphery, on the edge of things. And I guess I thought if we really took off and really committed ourselves, that I'd be drawn into the center. That never happened. In fact, everything collapsed spectacularly and catastrophically. I guess there had been mutterings and mumblings in this particular church that I was going to for a while, although I think the youth group were mostly insulated from it. Um, and at some point, well, for starters, it all came to head when the youth group went on a big trip round Eastern Europe. And I don't know the details because I went with another youth group, right? So the youth group at my church went on a big trip around Eastern Europe, and I prayed very hard about it. And for some reason, I'd never understood. I felt God was telling me to go to a different youth group's trip into Eastern Europe that was happening at the same time. You remember I mentioned this little, very almost very strict, very conservative, anti-charismatic church. Well, they were doing a trip into Eastern Europe with young people around the same time. They were going to do dance and song and all of this, and um, I just felt led to go with them. I don't know why, but I did. Instead of my own church's trip, which was a bit bizarre. We went to Poland, and I think they went to kind of other places. I don't know if they ever went to Romania, but like kind of more southerly kind of areas. I think they went to Switzerland at one point because they had contacts in Switzerland. So things went quite badly wrong, as I understand it, on this trip. Because while it was very powerful and the young people were doing this really great witnessing with like songs and drama and dance, as I understand it, things among the leadership became quite tense at times. And there'd been some discontent with the pastor and the way he'd been running things. So some months later, we come into church, we get called into no, we get called into a special meeting at church around one of the elders' houses, and it's like, yeah, the pastor's been asked to stand down temporarily. We've had some complaints, and we've got some other church leaders involved, and we've asked the pastor to step down temporarily pending a reconciliation process. Um, and we ask you all not to talk about anything. Not that we're telling you anything that you can talk about anyway. So that caused huge problems because this reconciliation process, it kind of stalled and he never came back. So they effectively kicked the pastor out. And he had a very strong vision for that church, a very dynamic vision for it to kind of um, really engage with the local community and to really spearhead what the youth could do in that respect. And that all fell by the wayside. The young people who were leading the youth group were the pastor's children, so they were asked to leave. And in the absence of their leadership, the youth leader basically took over and ceased to be a facilitator, and in fact became a youth leader conventionally, who just kind of turned it into a kind of Bible study for kids, very kind of relaxed and not very dynamic at all, you know. They added some policies that absolutely wrecked it, in terms of its dynamism and its influence, and also in terms of its viability for me as like a social area, because one of the first things they did was introduce this new rule that when they got to so many members, they would divide this group into two separate groups so that it never had more than so many members, which meant that every time I was starting to get to know people, at least half of those people would disappear. Um, and as someone who is autistic and struggles to make connections, that's not ideal. And I bucked against it because I was deep. I mean, on a number of levels, I was absolutely convinced that what was going on was wrong. I'd prayed about it very, very, very hard, and I felt that there was. I'm not saying whether or not the pastor did anything wrong, but it was very clear to me that the way that the issue was handled procedurally was ungodly, and unfair. And I didn't know how unfair at the time. I would only find out later on. And as I understand it, and I haven't heard all sides of the story, but as I understand it, it basically boiled down to a situation where the leaders of these other churches and the elders went to the pastor and said, "You know what you did?" To which he said, "Well, no, I don't know what I did. Now, if you tell me what I'm supposed to have done, um, we can go and we can be reconciled and I can make amends and we can make this right. It says, uh, no, you need to apologize publicly. And he said, and his response would be, well, I'm not going to apologize publicly when I don't know what I'm apologizing for. To which I responded, you know what you did. And it kind of cycled around like that perpetually, because they weren't prepared to actually tell him what specifically someone had complained about him, and what the accusations in detail were. And he wasn't prepared to kind of jump through a lot of hoops that were basically like blank check apologies for things that he may or may not have done. So it felt, I imagine, to him like the process was basically just designed to kick him out by stealth, and that's effectively what happened from my eyes. I didn't know any of that at the time. I just knew that there was this particular verse in the Bible that resonated with me. I think it's in Mark, and it says, "If your friend offends you, if your brother offends you, first go to him and tell him what he's done wrong. And if he won't listen, go with someone you respect to that person, and they should respect, and tell them what they've done wrong and reason with them. And maybe you will save your brother from ignorance and folly or whatever." And says, if they still won't listen, bring the matter before the whole assembly and have them tell them what they've done wrong. And if they really won't listen, you can kick them out. And I actually went to, I said, look, God is telling me you're doing is wrong. And um, and look, I have a biblical basis for this. This is how you handle. This is how the Bible says you handle some sort of transgression serious enough to kick someone out. And you've effectively kicked this guy out. And you see, it's voluntary, it's temporary. Well, it's been a while now, and it's not looking so temporary. But said, no, we have to be sensitive. We have to be sensitive. People have their privacy. Like, yeah, well, if they're that offended and that certain that they've been aggrieved, then they have to put their heads above the parapet and go on the record. And that did not go down well. I think that probably did not go down well at all, which is having been nominally praised as being incredibly passionate and on fire for Jesus, I was, I think, increasingly seen as a nut job. And of course, it didn't help that at the same time, the youth group got progressively less and less charismatic. There was this woman. It's always been immensely important to me, you know. If we believe in the Bible, and it's not just words, then we should expect to see miracles in our day and age, and particularly people being healed in our day and age. And there was a woman in the church who had bowel cancer, and she'd been fighting it for a long while, but the doctors had basically said, you are past treatment. And I wanted very strongly I felt like someone ought to be doing something about this, you know. And so I started asking if I could go and pray with this woman, and my mother facilitated this, and I did regularly go and see this woman and pray with her at our church. And she had been through a hell of a lot. And it was so difficult to kind of build her faith and to build my faith. But I kind of got to a stage where I was like, hey, I really believe God can heal you. This is not just a gimmick. It's not just words. It's not just something we do. And I ended up fasting, I think, for 15 days, something like that, because she said she was having, right, she didn't, because she was basically on palliative care, she really didn't get tests done very often. But she was going to have a test done to look at a blood test to look at the number of cancerous cells in her body that were circulating. And I said, we're going to pray. We're going to pray that this count should be going down rather than up. We're gonna we're gonna try and see if we can actually see some actual tangible impact, measurable impact that will build our faith from our prayers. So we're gonna see if this results from this blood test are gonna be good or not. And it was really, really, really good. But at the same time, she was really struggling because obviously she was in bowel cancer and it's horrible. It takes the energy out of you. And her own, the elders of the church had basically gone to her and said, you know, we know you've been offered a place in a hostel. We think you should take it. And she was like, well, you guys still praying for my healing? And says, look, we've been praying and we think you should prepare to die. It's like, where in the Bible does it says you shall call the elders of the church and they shall tell you prepare to die? It says call the elders of the church and they shall anoint you with oil and pray for you to be healed. That's what it says. Um, so I was pretty aggrieved by that. But she did go into the hostel, and from that point onwards, she declined very, very rapidly. And you can, of course, turn around and say to me that doesn't mean much because you don't believe in that, and that's absolutely fine. Maybe it was just the course of the disease. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you, no, but there was a time when my position of trying to stand in faith and encourage her would have been the default position, the supported position, and any kind of discussion. I remember being asked to give a sermon in the youth group after it had been spun. So this youth group, the church decided they didn't even want it anymore. They spun it into a separate organization, and but the son of the girl of the woman who I was praying for was in that youth group, and I was asked to give a sermon, and I decided to give the sermon on healing, and I got a phone call from the youth leader later on saying how offensive it was that I'd given a sermon on healing when this lad's mother is sick with bowel cancer, and how awful it made him feel, and that sort of thing. It's like it wasn't designed to make anyone feel awful. It was designed to fill people with faith. And so the entire position of the youth group and the entire ethos of it completely flipped. Um, and in the end, I think when I was approaching 18, 20, something like that, they kicked me out anyway. Actually, it must have been around 18, I think, or a little bit after 18, 18, 19. And I think it was something on the lines of we'd had a meeting, and the meeting had basically turned into like a business meeting. We'd had a kind of a meeting about the growth of the youth group, and it's now multiple branches of this youth group because it's kept dividing. And it sounded like something in a corporate meeting, this is our business strategy almost kind of thing. Uh, and I had a lot to say about that. Um, I had a lot to say about that. Um, and so we were going around the room saying, what did you think about the kind of the gathering of the multiple different youth groups together on such and such a day? And I said, and they said, but you can only use one word. And I've said to myself, I can't sum it up in one word. Please don't make me try and sum it up in one word. No, you must use one word. And said, well, the word I would use is death then, because it was a dead meeting. It was a meeting, and that's how I felt. It was like the dream that we had was dying, the dynamic spiritual life that we'd had was dying, and um, and they turned up at my house, a few days later and said, "We think you need to leave. You're too old now. Go." So yeah, I did not go to plan. I did not go to plan. Meanwhile, I'd started an A level in the age of 15. My mum had given up trying to get me into school. She tried to get me into every school you could imagine that was private. Her one red line, I think, was that she wasn't willing to put me in a state school. Um, where they would have to take me. And that dyslexia diagnosis that they had got me was now like a weight around my neck, at least in their eyes, because it meant that every private school they approached refused to take me until they found one very expensive private school um, where I had a really nice, interesting conversation with the headmaster, the head teacher, um, and then kind of about science and religion and about my views and all of this and my interests and my hobbies, and they sent me out of a room for I imagine half an hour. I can't remember exactly how long it was, so my mum could finish up talking to this headmaster, and she kind of came in, picked me up, and took me out and says, "We're not sending you here." And what had transpired apparently while I was out of the room was that he basically turned around and said to something on the lines of, "Your kid's very religious, very spiritual. You should understand we don't provide any Christian content here in this school because obviously this is the UK. You may not know it's quite normal for you to have religious content in schools, particularly traditional state schools. You were meant to have an assembly that was predominantly Christian in character. Uh, so, um, yeah. And I think something about the way he said it, or the kind of the emphasis he put on it, seemed to suggest, to her that this was not the place for me. So I don't know. That was the only time they actually thought they found a school that they could put me in. So college it was, an adult college. My mother found a loophole. She managed to persuade the adult college that if I, which normally would only take you at the age of 16, um, but if I were to go in with her and she were to accompany me and do the course with me, I could do GCSEs there. So I did GCSEs at the adult college with my mum. And then I went on to do A levels on my own without her because once you're 16, they don't need you to have an adult to hold your hand or anything. And I didn't really make any friends. It was great in terms of the educational aspect. I think I was very well suited to teaching me. It was far better than any school I'd ever had. Um, the kind of the sit down, attend the lecture, go into the workshop, ask for help if you need it system worked well for me in terms of learning. Um, It didn't really work, and that was basically how maths and English was taught. It didn't really work very well for me in terms of making social connections. Um, Nevertheless, I persevered. I remember doing my A level computing course and chatting to because we used to hang around in the corridor outside of the classroom before they opened it up, all kind of queued up against the wall. I remember chatting to those guys, and they seemed nice, but never really bridged that gap, I think. I think at this stage, my experience of life was just so different to everybody else's that it wasn't like there was a lot that we could just talk about and connect over. And I guess I needed more time to warm up to them and to get used to sort of relating and communicating. I just was operating at a handicap, I guess, from a lack of experience of people my own age, I guess, really. Because outside of these church groups, I really didn't have any experience of people my own age, and they were all kind of churchy, although perhaps for one to some less extent. So I did. I had A level. I did A level physics, and that was interesting. I relate teenage girls and an early 20s kind of dude who were clearly from a rough neighborhood, and they told a lot of dirty jokes. um, which was always interesting to listen to. Um, but I used to hang around with them because it didn't put me off. It didn't put me off. And they would always say every time we hang out with Peter, we always end up talking about really serious and cerebral stuff because we would have breaks between our lectures and we'd go down to the canteen together because there was a canteen in that building. And we'd end up chatting on the table together. And we just have these really fun little intellectual conversations. And that's probably the closest I ever came to having friends. And I couldn't remember their names for the life of me. Not for the life of me. They're nice enough people, but aside from dirty jokes and random intellectual conversations I kept inserting, I never really got to know their backgrounds and about them personally. My A levels went fine for the most part until A level computing started to get towards the end of a practical project. Things went really, really badly wrong there. Um, they changed the rules on A level computing for about 1 year. Up until that point, the practical project was for a theoretical user. So you would have to invent an imaginary person with an imaginary problem and then fix it using computer programming. You'd have to address it using computer programming. You'd have to make your own software, and then you'd kind of submit that as your project. That year, they decided it had to be a real person. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. It had to be a real person, and getting their real feedback was part of the process of how you were marked. Um, well, that didn't go well. For starters, I couldn't get anyone. Everyone else seemed to have an uncle or someone who, or maybe they were making it up, I don't know, but someone whom had nominally a computer problem that they could fix, a problem they could fix through software or creating some sort of computational thing. I did not. I did not. Um, and even though there was no protocol for it, the college very reluctantly reached out and made contact with someone for me, a university professor. In fact, it was a head of a university department. And he wanted a virtual reality tour of his university department, which wasn't a great fit for the syllabus. If I'd have been paying more attention to the syllabus at the time, I would have said, like, this isn't great because there's not going to be that much programming in it. I had to inject more programming into it at the end of a project, and even that didn't work very well because problems. So, um, they flake out on this project. They initially agree that they will buy me a particular piece of software that will enable me to make this project because it's not a standard programming project. It requires some specialist software. They then flake out and disagree and say, we're not going to give you this software. And that's in the middle of the project. And the head of the department, has gone on holiday or has become unavailable and won't respond to my emails during this period. So I'm losing time to do the project before I actually get the software that I can use to do it. But I go around, eventually get the software. I eventually go around different pieces of software. I go around making a load of VR panoramas of this particular campus. And I link them all together. And the programming content of the project is I make a Java applet, first ever Java applet I'd ever made. Never tried to make one before. A Java applet that works as a navigation tool. And that's the programming content. Except I didn't understand Java applet security extensions because you can't run a Java applet locally, kind of. Not without putting in a load of security. It also meant that when they tested my project, they couldn't get that to run. And what's worse, this professor, again, did not respond with his feedback on time. So this project that I had been done, I got 30 marks out of 100 for this project. And this project was a massive part of my course. I failed my A-level computing degree, my A-level computing course. I got the best result in the entire college on the technical paper, the paper that's kind of programming and hardware and that sort of thing. The best result in the college, but I still managed to fail the course because of this incredibly bad mark on the practical project. So what that meant in practice was that I did not have an A level to go to university, and I didn't even want to go to university. I did not have my sufficient number of A levels to get into university. I didn't want to go to university anyway. There was big arguments with my parents over this, and when I didn't have the results, they no longer had the leverage to push me into it. I wanted to go into missions. I wanted to go into ministry, um, but uh, but it didn't happen, and I lacked the social skills to make it happen. Um, off my own back, and there wasn't anyone to partner with me to make it happen. There weren't any organizations that I could have jumped into. Um, Occasionally, friends of the family would say, "Why don't you get involved with Youth with a Mission?" which is the same organization that ran the King's Kids Boot Camp. Um, and the reason I didn't was they mostly do missions abroad in rural areas, third world countries, that sort of thing. And I didn't feel called to third world countries. I didn't feel called to kind of the Sahara or whatever. I felt called to urban environments and specifically my city. Um, and on top of all of that, kind of they mostly operate on a kind of internship holiday-esque program whereby they get young people to raise money from their friends and family so that they can do a year's volunteering in a third world country. And for the sake of 1 year's experience or 2 years experience, it would be like me going on a gap year. And I'm sure my parents would rather I'd spent what effectively became my gap year doing something productive, but or they would have seen as productive. Um, but I wanted it as a lifestyle, not as a taster session, as a one-off. I didn't want to go to Africa where I didn't feel called um, to spend a year working, only to come home and then have to do ordinary life and university and so forth. Um, so that didn't go quite well either. Um, Now, if I wind back a bit, I'll talk about the other big influence in my life, the other big youth group that I was a part of. Actually, let's talk about the women because that's a big part of life and that's a big part of growing up. Um, in this youth group, in this church that I was in, the one that the church had imploded, I found another girl whom I had another crush on. And I'm sure she knew eventually by the end of it, or at least suspected very strongly. I'm always getting fixated on women and not having the courage to tell them. That was the story of my youth. But I did get the sense that so that particular group of friends, I thought that we really could become lifelong friends and people area, our local community. And this particular girl whom I had this crush on went to Israel to do some volunteer work. Brilliant, great stuff. And by all accounts, really strongly impacted her. She came back. This was kind of before everything totally went to pot. I still had some kind of influence there, and I remember I wasn't the bad guy yet. I don't think I was. I remember praying and just kinda getting this sense, this divine leading that in spite of her just having just gone as like a one-off holiday thing, that she had a strong desire to go back and go there permanently. And I don't know how I got this. I mean, it was I was praying about my future and the future of my friends, actually, and that came up. And I'm like, "But is that right, God? Because I thought she had a place here in the thing that you were planning." And I remember ringing her and saying, "Look, this may be weird because I know you've only just come back and there's no plans for you to go back, but I felt God was telling me that you were thinking of going back there permanently. And I don't want to, tell you what to do, but I think God's saying that there's something much better for you if you stay." And she said, "Oh, I have no plans to go back. I don't know where you got that from, but thank you very much for thinking of me and praying about me, and if and for passing this along. But I have no plans to ever go back to Israel." And she's married to a nice Jewish guy and lives in Israel now. Um, and I'm so happy for her, I guess. But as you know, I felt that the thing that God wanted to do then at that stage, in that place, and that time of my life was kind of a lost opportunity. So many things in life, lost opportunities. So this other youth group I used to go to, the one in the very conservative, anti-charismatic church, um, that was much earthier. The kids weren't quite so spiritually minded, and a lot of them had kind of more rough and worldly upbringings and exposure to the world, and they were the kind to be playing spin the bottle and sneaking off to McDonald's. I think at one stage they had to physically ban them from leaving the cafe to go over the road to McDonald's because they thought the food that they were serving at the cafe was so rubbish, and they would rather nip off to McDonald's and bring back like Big Macs, or just spend half an hour over there before coming back to the youth night. Um, but it was a great place. They had so much life and energy, and I should never have turned my nose up at it or been so snooty. The guys and girls kissing round the back and hiding in closets and laughing and taking the mick and all of that was all life. It was youth, and it would have been better if I'd have gotten stuck in. But I was very dutiful there and very full of. I kind of the youth leaders wanted to make it more spiritual, and I was all for that, and we ended up having like a rule that you had to have like a 15-minute meeting in the middle of the cafe stuff to talk about something biblical or spiritual or something like that, and it kind of went on a rota for different people to prepare. There was a list of approved, kind of respected young people who prepared sections, and I was one of them. Um, but I got to be honest, yeah, it went wrong. So that particular group decided to go to Poland to do some evangelical work, and that was a good trip, and it was also a dreadful trip because I don't think they had realized how passionate I was about this. I don't think the leaders were prepared for how passionate I was about this, and we initially had been doing the same sort of stuff that we have been doing, uh, the same we're trying to go for the same sort of approach at that kind of like, of kind of like artistic expression through drama and dance and song. The problem was our young people sucked. They didn't put the work in, they didn't put the effort in, they weren't very disciplined, and um, and instead of kind of whipping them into shape, um, our leaders kind of gave up and said, "What we're going to do is we're just going to do choir singing. We're not going to do any drama because it's too difficult. We're not going to do any dance because you're uncoordinated." And I said, "Look, can't you just take the ones who have a certain passion for it in like a group of 3 or 4 and just work with them to do something? Split them into smaller groups and do different little bits and just make them concentrate on one thing." And they're like, "No, we're not doing that. We must have unity. And if we're not all involved, it's not unity. Um, we need to have the power of you all there singing together. That's unity." Like, unity isn't everyone all in the same place doing the same thing. It's not. It's just ineffectual. We're going to be singing English hymns, old-fashioned English hymns in a bloody Polish town. No one's going to understand anything we're saying. It's going to be totally irrelevant. Um, and the kids, they treated it as being like an 1830 holiday or something, um, which I should have gone along with. It would have done me the world of good to, but no. Um, I took it very, very seriously. And I was very, very concerned that we weren't having any real impact. And I'm like, God, why did you send me here to this trip instead of a much more dynamic one with the other church? Um, why did you do that? What was the purpose of me being here? And I prayed about it and I prayed about it. And someone asked me if I wanted to give my testimony because I'd said I'd prayed very strongly about whether I should come to this trip or another one. And they said I ought to come to this one. And they said, right, that's great. You should give a talk on that. We'll get a translator and you can give a talk on that. And I prayed so hard and I thought about it so long about how I would put into words um, what it was I felt that God had sent me to this place, to this particular part of Poland for. Um, and I got like 3 or 4 sentences into it when they tapped me on the shoulder and pulled me out and says, "No, this is potentially offensive. You might upset people. We're pulling you out the back here. What's going on?" And I was talking about being alive in Christ and dead in Christ, and I was saying like, "This is we've come to make this community alive in Christ instead of dead in Christ." Like you're telling them people that they're dead inside. Don't tell people they're dead inside. Like, so I had a massive argument with the leadership team. Felt very badly done to, in fairness, which I think I probably was. If you don't want someone to talk, don't give them the microphone, you know? But when I look back on that time as a holiday rather than a missions trip, I see how wonderful it was to be around other young people. I remember what it was like sitting on the sand on the beach in Poland, surrounded by stunning young women in bikinis, mucking about, splashing in the water. And there was one particularly attractive one that was like, "Why you keep splashing me with water? Do you have some like crush on me?" And I totally did. With a little blonde streak of hair, just a one little streak she'd dyed blonde. They were just out to have a good time. It would have probably have done me good to spend more of my life trying that as a young person. So this little ultra conservative youth group would also kind of exclude me eventually. And again, because I was very serious, but I'm getting ahead of myself. they were fascinating people. I'd have fascinating conversations with them. I probably had more exciting conversations with them than I did with the people at the main church because they were all enamored with each other, and I never really felt 100% included there. But but at this conservative church, the young kids there were much friendlier, much warmer, and much more interested in discussing things. I remember sitting down with this one girl who was stunningly beautiful, who was probably 17 going on 18, and I would have been 15 at the time, 16 maybe, I think 15. Um, and we sat down and had a long conversation about science and philosophy, and it was absolutely fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. I thought I made a new friend here. She thought a little bit more than that. Um, she apparently developed a massive crush on me. Um, and also the misapprehension, but I was about 2 or 3 years older than I was. She thought I was kind of close to her age. Um, so I get called round the back of the round to the stairwell, which is like the more private area of this youth cafe. And these kids are telling me like this girl really really likes you and wants you to go out with her, and what do you say? And I was at that point, but I was like, how does one process this? I'm not used to girls being interested in me. And on top of that, I was thinking about this girl I had a massive crush on, this other girl. I'm thinking, and I've been really crushing hard on her, and I've been like, it's not fair to kind of, when I hadn't previously had any kind of particular inclination to this girl, to kind of lead her on by saying I'm interested in dating her, when I know that I'm also got this other girl who's massively on my mind, even though I've already accepted she's unattainable at this point. Uh, what a fool. And so I turned this girl down, but everyone made it incredibly awkward. And they're like, but why do you not want to go out with this girl? What's wrong with her? She's beautiful. And like, yeah, she's very attractive. And she's like, and she's in tears. And they're making it worse by probing why I don't want to go out with her. And I'm like, don't want to talk about it. Don't da, 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 da. I bet you kind of just say, why don't you just kiss her and see if you like it? And I'm like, oh, could you not suggested coffee and see if you like it? Not that I actually drink coffee, but a trip out for a meal and think we like it. So stupidly, I kind of totally soured this relationship by kind of running away, kind of, which is a sensible thing to do, I guess, I suppose, or not. Not the sensible thing to do. I don't know. The sensible thing to do would have just have been to say, I have a crush on another girl. Nothing's ever going to come of it, but I don't want to date someone. That would have been the mature way to handle it, to just express my feelings, but no, can't do that. Um, because I didn't want to talk about this other girl. It seems silly to me to still be holding a torch for someone under those circumstances. So this youth group, um, it's open to everyone, different churches, non-churches, people from just anywhere. And kids from the local rough estate started coming into this church youth group, which it was great. We should have seen it as a plus, but the parents didn't see it as a plus. They didn't want their kids associating with the rough lads. They certainly didn't want their young daughters associating with the rough lads. And there was quite a lot of hanky panky going on, uh, or at least that sort of thing. So they definitely didn't want them getting involved in that with the rough lads. And then there was a fight outside the building, or at the building. Someone got punched. There was someone got a cut on their face. It was not good. And the leaders freaked and said, "Okay, we need to keep these lads out. So those particular lads have been banned, but we also need to keep the rough elements out. So we're going to start charging a fee. You're going to have to pay like 50p to get in. And like, it's not going to keep them out. A, that's a wrong outlook to have. We should be seeing this as an evangelism opportunity. I was very vocal about that. But even if that's, but 50p ain't going to keep anyone out. Um, and it didn't. And there are a couple more issues and tense moments, and they just banned everyone not from their church. And I think it was quite convenient to them because I'd been so vocally against a lot of what had happened on the Poland trip, and also their lack of taking this evangelical opportunity, for them to just say that no one from not from our church is allowed anymore, which of course excluded me as well. So I was kind of excluded from this youth activity at the same time. Kind of concludes my exclusion from my entire social life, because I never had a social life outside of church as a teenager. I never really developed one at adult college. I never really did things as a young person, never went to events outside of churches. Even ones I wanted to, my parents blocked, as I said, laser tag and karate and things that I'd tried to engage in. They were like, no. Um, so it was all just church or nothing in terms of my social life, and the church kicked me out, so I didn't have a social life. And so not only did I fail in kind of building any kind of impact and ministry and activity in my local area, I also failed in developing any kind of social life, and I never got to do any of those things I thought I would, like kissing girls around the back of the youth building, or going on adventures, or sneaking into pubs underage, which I know some of the other kids at the kind of rougher youth group did. Um, with that one guy whom I had a really like shallow friendship with at the other church, and never got invited to wild house parties. Never got. I think once that girl who had asked me out with two of the youth leaders and their daughters, were going to a concert of a Christian band I really liked, and I once went to a concert with them. It was a worldwide message tribe, actually, and a couple of other Movation-related bands were doing a concert in Manchester, I think, and that's when that girl discovered that the guy she'd asked out was actually 15 and not closer 17, 18 as she'd assumed, because she was surprised that I couldn't drive. Like, you don't even have a provisional license? Like, no, I'm 15. And so that one concert is probably all of my other experiences are kind of like Christian-y, churchy. I mean, that was a Christian churchy thing. I went to a couple of youth away camps, Soul Survivor, Harvest, that sort of thing. But again, the people I went with, I felt kind of on the peripheries. In a tent on my own, people not really spending that much time with me, floating around on my own most of the time. I never really built that relationship with other people my own age, which it took me 3 years after finishing my A level to get to. It took me 3 years to get to university. I'll talk about that phase of my life next. I'll talk about them, as it were, between 18 and 22. 21, 22, yeah, 22, 23. Yeah, because there's a lot to talk about there. Life didn't just stop. But when I realized that my youth really was behind me, life kinda did just stop, or at least it felt like it did. Is there anything I've missed? Anything particularly important? No, nothing comes to mind. I hope that you all are blessed and encouraged. Not necessarily the purpose of these videos to bless and encourage. I think it's probably more effective as a warning. What it's warning against, I don't know, but I hope that it's useful to somebody. If nothing else, one day when I'm gone, because we will all be gone one day, there are people left over who have questions. I certainly have questions. Maybe this will help them answer some of their questions.